I-24 News on this December 23rd, 2015, and we are back in Israel, where Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on his first official visit to the state since taking office last year following the revolution. Poroshenko stressed the similarities between both countries, existing in a turbulent region and suffering constant terror attacks. The leaders signed a series of bilateral agreements, including on cooperation in science and technology, and retired to a private conversation. A few hours after meeting with Poroshenko, Netanyahu held a phone conversation with Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. The two reportedly discussed the war in Syria and ways of improving coordination on anti-terror efforts. The call comes in the wake of an alleged Israeli strike in Syria that killed a Hezbollah militant leader on Sunday. Russian presence in the neighboring country in support of President Bashar Assad makes it more difficult and dangerous for Israel to operate, as it has reportedly done in recent years. Now, to discuss what this all means, the Israeli-Russian-Ukrainian trifecta, I'm joined in studio by Paula Sleer, Russia Today's bureau chief. I want to thank you for being with us. Before anything else, let's take a look at the following report about the Poroshenko visit. Break it down from there.
President Poroshenko, it's a pleasure to welcome you personally in Jerusalem.
The Israeli Prime Minister may have gotten Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko's name wrong as he welcomed him on his first official visit to Israel, but it was still mostly smiles for the television cameras. Israel's ties with Ukraine have traditionally been warm. Trade between the two countries stands at $1.3 billion annually, and the visit was an opportunity to sign several bilateral agreements in the fields of science, culture, and transport. But there are also geopolitical interests involved.
We understand now how close is our connection with Israel.
Poroshenko, for his part, was eager to draw parallels between Israel's history and Ukraine's current struggles.
For our two countries and people, we stand on the similar path. Like Israelis for decades, Ukrainian people throughout the last 1.5 years bravely resist external aggression.
But is Israel as willing to accept the comparison? The Ukrainian embrace is one that could cause tensions for Israel, considering Kiev's current conflict with Moscow. The Kremlin released a statement saying that Russian President Vladimir Putin had also spoken with Netanyahu Tuesday over the phone, with the two agreeing to coordinate in the fight against terrorism in the Middle East. The relationship with Russia is a major strategic priority for the government in Jerusalem. Earlier this year, Israel agreed to block the sale of military drones to Ukraine in response to Russian pressure. Indeed, Moscow has significant leverage over Israel, especially in relation to Iran, which still awaits the delivery of the Russian S-300 missile defense system. As regards Syria, Russia has publicly stated it respects Israel's security interests there, and Jerusalem would like to keep it that way. Media reports have attributed a number of recent airstrikes in Syrian territory to Israel, despite the protection the Assad regime receives from the Russian military.
All of Russia's actions in the region have always been and will always be extremely responsible.
With so many complex interests at stake, it seems this particular friendship may only be able to go so far.
Now, before anything else, let's first go straight to Tal Shalev, I-24 News diplomatic correspondent on her way to Jerusalem. But Tal, good morning to you. Before we speak about President Poroshenko, there was a phone conversation last night between President Putin and the Israeli Prime Minister. Was that in order to brief him about the meeting with the Ukrainian president?
Well, not necessarily. We can assume the topic did come up, but that is just an assumption which is not verified or confirmed. According to the official statements by both the Prime Minister's office and the Kremlin, the main topic of discussion was Syria and the ongoing civil war and Russian intervention in Syria, and the two leaders agreed to continue dialogue, quote unquote, in the past few months since Russia has increased its military boost in Syria. Putin and Netanyahu have been in constant contact. They have a phone call or a meeting every few weeks. This is part of Israel's attempt to try and control or maybe maintain the situation, which does have very grave strategical implications on Israel. And we can assume that the main topic of discussion was probably the targeted killing of Samir Kuntar earlier this week in Damascus. There have been speculations. How much did Russia know about this operation, which has been attributed to Israel? So that was the main topic of discussion. But of course, coming hours after Netanyahu meets with Poroshenko, it is easy to speculate, or at least nice to speculate, that this was also part of their discussion.
Part of the discussion. What's on the table today for President Poroshenko?
Well, today, Poroshenko will be addressing the Israeli parliament. Yesterday, we saw him in his official meetings with both the Israeli prime minister and with the Israeli president, trying to keep a very cautious approach. We didn't hear him directly mention Russia or directly name Putin. We do understand from Israeli officials in the foreign ministry that both sides prefer to continue to walk this very thin line, and that Ukraine understands that for Israel this is a very sensitive issue, but it'll be interesting to see how exactly will the issue come up in this public address to the Israeli parliament.
Tal Shalev, thank you for joining us en route to Jerusalem. Paula Slier, Russia Today's bureau chief. How sensitive is this for Israel?
I think it's more sensitive for Israel than it is for the Russians.
Exactly.
So many people are asking me the question, is Russia concerned? But I think the phone call that Tal prefaced, the initiative came from the Israeli side. It was Prime Minister Netanyahu phoning President Putin to talk about Syria and further cooperation. I think it's also interesting that the Ukrainian president was met by a head of a department in the foreign ministry when he arrived here in Israel. He wasn't met by Netanyahu. He wasn't met by minister. Now, whether one reads into that the Israelis are trying to downplay this visit, but I certainly think that for the Russians, they're not overly concerned. Having said that, there are two red lines for the Russians. If in any way Poroshenko seeks to get support from the Israelis for the Ukrainian military's operation in eastern Ukraine, that would be a red line. That seems unlikely because Poroshenko did come here a year ago before he became president and in a secret meeting tried to get that support, and Israel remained neutral on the issue. The other red line for the Russians would be the issue of Crimea. And in that respect, in the past, the Americans have tried to pull Israel into the dialogue and ask the Israelis to give backing to America's criticism of Russia in its operations in Crimea, and Israel remained neutral on that issue as well. So it also doesn't seem as if Israel will change its stance. And really, those are the two main concerns that the Russians would have. And as I say, neither seems to be realistic.
Neither seems to be realistic. But then what is the point of the visit to this, in your mind?
I think it's really just a visit that looks at building bilateral agreements. I mean, that's what the press release says. That's what the statements say.
It's for the first time a press release is actually honest. Okay.
What is interesting, but can be foreseen, is the statements that Poroshenko is making. He talks about terrorism. He talks about Ukraine understanding Israel's fight against terrorism. But he's, of course, referring to terrorism that he sees as the pro-Russian rebels that are on the east of the country. And the Israelis are very clever. They're not going to be drawn into that war of games in war of words in any way, trying to support or infer that, yes, the Russians in any way are or can be classified as part of the terrorist group. There is one other thing, Yael. The Israelis have been indicating that they're thinking about potentially selling gas.
I was actually, that was my next question, because I think all these meetings, this is really supportive of the Netanyahu line that the gas reserves found off the shores of Israel, one that they're very much in contention right now when it comes to the plan of how to sell and how to export it. That's something that Israel is looking to sell, isn't it?
And there is some speculation that Poroshenko might actually be coming to the Israelis to say, see us as a potential market. Having said that, Ukraine...
If Israel sells gas to the Ukraine, isn't that another red line for Russia?
It is a red line, but first you need to ask the question, why would Israel sell gas to the Ukrainians? The Ukrainians owe the Russians something like $3 or $4 billion because they haven't been able to pay for the gas they've received.
Why should that be Israel's concern?
Well, why would Israel go to a country as a potential buyer who doesn't have money? The Russians are actually going to take the Ukrainians to court over the issue. Surely Israel would look towards European markets who actually have money to buy gas, rather than to Ukraine,
unless
who A, has no gas.
Steps in and gives the money to Ukraine and helps it buy that. You know, I mean,
and yes, that would be a red line, certainly. Maybe it wouldn't be as much of a red line as the other issues, but that certainly won't be something that Moscow would look at favorably. The Israelis are much more concerned about their relationship with Russia vis-a-vis Syria, vis-a-vis Iran. Why get involved in something that doesn't directly affect Israel through Ukraine?
Through the Ukraine. But I think the gas story is one that we'll be dealing with quite for the next few weeks. Paula Slier, thank you, but you're staying in studio as we move along.